So first, just for any of you that might not know, I want to talk a little bit about what Blinkist is and what we do. So we are a mobile app on Android and iOS. And currently, we basically make key takeaways from nonfiction books available in text and audio. So basically, you can come to us, and if there's something you're interested in learning, but you maybe don't have time to read the entire book, or maybe you're just not sure if you want to commit to it yet, you can get the key information in about 15 minutes. And you can either read, or you can listen on your commute, or while you're driving, or something like that. Our ambition, though, it kind of goes beyond this. What we really want to build is basically a lifelong learning product. So we really want to think about how we can bring learning to people and integrate it into their lives, rather than creating a more formalized learning experience that people have to create time for. So we're thinking about creating content that fits into your morning, fits into your afternoon, fits into your evening, and really something that you can use day to day to continue to develop and grow, and then inspire you to go deeper and then to actually go read the book if you want to learn more. So, how many of you recognize this quote? Who said it? Madonna. We're not legally allowed to show a picture of Madonna, so you can pretend that she's up here. But yes, so Madonna said we're living in a material world, and it's true. And I think a lot of times we as product managers, what we really want to do is create a product that changes people's lives, that really makes people's lives better. But we also have to build a business. We have to build a sustainable business. And like most of these, like most other companies, Blinkist also has the same challenge in the beginning. So of course, as a young company, we're very focused on growth, activation, and conversion. We were running a lot of experiments. We got pretty good at this, to be honest. We were running a lot of iterative A/B testing, optimizing the subscription flow. But at some point, we started to see dwindling returns on this. Basically, we started to see that the improvements got smaller and smaller. So we realized that what we really need to do is find kind of more of a game changer, something a little bit bigger that's really going to change what conversion looks like for us. So at this point, we moved from being a transactional app to a subscription-based app. And a lot of subscription-based apps, in the US at least, were moving to the free trial model, where you could basically sign up, try the product, and then subscribe afterwards. It was a bit of a less popular model in Europe at the time, but we decided to try it anyway. We called it the soft paywall experiment. And so we launched this in the kind of worldwide as an A/B test. Oops, there is a slide missing. Sorry. Anyways, we saw over 60% uplift in terms of the conversion that we were seeing. So this was actually a massive uplift, much more than we expected. So at the time we thought, great, this we really changed the business model. We've really unlocked a new opportunity for us. Everything is going to be great. We can just relax, and the business is just going to magically grow to massive proportions. What we didn't expect is what you see here. So this is the drop in retention from the time we started to roll out the soft paywall to the time it was rolled out to everybody. What you can see here is that it dropped from 80% in the first month all the way down to 58%. And this, of course, for us was like a very unexpected and sad moment. Just like this movie might have been for Ben Affleck. So in retrospect, it makes sense, right? So you increase conversion, you let in more low-intent users, and then they come, they use the product, but they're not so committed to it. And so if something doesn't go their way, or they don't actually have the time they thought they would, they start to drop off early on. So we realized that as a company, now we were growing faster, our business was growing faster, but it wasn't really sustainable. We were churning through users really quickly, and we didn't want to grow this way. We wanted to find a way to actually keep people around and actually give them the value that they're paying for, right? To deliver on that value. So we realized that, we still, of course, need to focus on these three things, but we now also need to think about engagement, retention, and renewal. And for us as a company, this was a big shift. So I'm going to now talk about how we made this transition and what we learned. So I'm going to walk through these 4 lessons. We're going to talk about how metrics need to change if you're trying to focus on retention. We're going to talk about how thinking about the size of the features you build needs to change. We'll talk about collecting feedback in the product. And we'll also talk about how your organization may need to change to adapt. So measure once, cut twice. So like I mentioned, we as a company had at this point, this is about 2017, we started making the shift. But we as a company were very familiar with conversion metrics. We've been working with them for a long time. So the nice thing about these is that, first of all, they're very clear. Usually you maybe have only a few numbers that you need to look at, like how many people sign up for the free trial, how many people ultimately subscribe, what are your proceeds per user, things like this. But it's usually pretty easy to understand what everything means. They're also quite quick. So basically you can launch an experiment and within a few weeks you know the result of that experiment because you're either getting conversion right away or at most maybe you're waiting 7 days to see if somebody retains from a free trial into an actual subscription. And they're also actionable, right? So you might launch a subscription screen test. If it wins, you roll it out to everybody. If it loses, you go back to the drawing board and try something else. But you pretty much know what you need to do based on the results. So that's great. That makes things pretty easy in the conversion world. But of course, we now needed to move to the retention world. And we needed to create a whole new set, or define a whole new set of KPIs and metrics that also would let us actually measure everything we're doing. So we as a product team started doing a lot of research into this and realized that retention metrics are actually way more complex and way more difficult to understand and to use. So at first we said, okay, well, let's just look at renewal, right? So we look at conversion here. It just makes sense to look at renewal because that's the continuation of kind of the same story. The problem is that most of our users subscribe for a year. We only have very few monthly or quarterly users. And so this means we would actually have to wait for an entire year to measure results. So obviously this is not practical if you want to be very agile and experiment-driven. Then we said, okay, maybe we can look at retention. Maybe we can just see how long do people stay around in the product before their usage drops off. The issue there is that we looked at our natural usage interval in the product, and we're not a daily use app. We're more like people come back every 2 weeks or something like this, at least in the 80th percentile. And so this still means that it's going to take us months to really see the drop-off, because usually we see drop-off after the first month, so in the second or third month, something like that. So again, if we really want to be agile and experiment-driven, this is also very hard to do. So then we said, okay, maybe we can find predictors. Maybe we can find really early on actions that predict if somebody is going to retain in the product. So this is an analysis that our BI team ran. If you don't understand what it means, you're not alone. I also don't really understand what it means, but it was explained to me. So basically, we took a bunch of users, some of whom have churned and some who had not, and we looked at all of the early actions they took and tried to see, are there any patterns? Can we find any predictors of the fact that they're going to stick around? And the only real predictor we found was that people who stuck around also tended to consume content from 9 or more categories. So all of our content is classified into categories, and people who consumed content from a broader range also tended to retain longer. So then we said, okay, let's see if we can actually take this data and run an experiment and see if we can improve retention. So what you see here is our old categories flow. So this is at the home screen, and there's this like really obscure icon that nobody understands. You click that, you then see a list of categories, and then you can look at the books in the category. So we decided to update this. We put categories directly on the Discover screen, kind of close to the top. We chose the most popular categories and put them at the top, made them very visible, and then launched this. This is a much better flow, much simpler flow for users. And actually, we saw a lot of impact when it comes to content discovery. So people were discovering more content. People were discovering content from a broader range of categories. The impact kind of in the short term was there. But what wasn't there was improved retention. There was actually no effect on retention whatsoever. And so what we realized kind of thinking about this is like, maybe that was just correlation. Maybe there was no causation there, right? Because maybe people who are more curious come to your product and they're more likely to explore content from a lot of categories. They're also more likely to stick around longer because they want to read a lot more content than other users. So there might not actually be any causation there, and therefore identifying this as a predictor is not really helpful in improving your product and driving it forward. And so we have now gone back and redefined a completely new set of metrics, and really more of like a metric framework that we use. So we have a Northstar, which for us right now is the amount of time spent by users in content consumption. Because we are a learning app, we want people to come and consume content and learn, and so we think that the more they do this, the better. Although I found Purnima's point really interesting, and maybe it's not about maximizing that time. But for now, this is our focus. And then underneath that, we have behavioral KPIs. So these are kind of like large-scale behaviors we're trying to measure. So what we look at is retention. So how long does somebody stick around and stay active? Engagement. So when they are active, how much time are they spending in content? Frequency. How often are they coming back? And then lastly, we look at value, which is basically NPS, App Store ratings, and things like that, that help us understand, okay, maybe they're not using the product a lot, but are they still deriving a lot of value from it or not? Then underneath this, we have product funnel KPIs. So this basically zooms in one level. And then we say, okay, for somebody who's actually actively using the product, how do they use the product? And here we look at a few things. We look at discovery rate, so how often people are finding something new to read or listen to. Then consumption rate, so how much are they actually consuming content. Completion rate, so how often do they finish what they've started. And then resumption rate, which tells us if they did not complete something in one session, are they actually coming back to it, or are they just abandoning that piece of content? And then lastly, we still have predictors, so we still believe that we can make this work. We're now working with a freelance data scientist to actually look at a lot of the usage data and see if we can find actual causative relationships and not just correlations. Lesson 2, size matters. So I think as PMs, we often face this dilemma. Do we want to work on something smaller? Do we want to work on a low-hanging fruit? Do we want to kind of focus on optimizing? Or do we want to go for something big, something that might take longer to build, but actually might have a much bigger impact on the product? And how do you decide which one you should be doing? So 2 examples of things we built. One is categories, which I already talked about. And the second one is this little number of reads indicator. Also on the Discover screen was just something we added as another signal to help people decide what they want to read based on kind of the social signal of how many people have already consumed this piece of content. And with this experiment, we saw exactly the same thing as we saw with categories. There was a lot of uplift in actual discovery, but no impact on retention whatsoever. And so what we realized through this is that if we actually want to impact long-term, large-scale behaviors, like how do people actually sustainably day over day use your product, you also have to think big. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend a lot of time building something, but you need to think about building features that are going to have a real impact on how people use your product, like the model of how they use it, not just the details. So here you see something, a new feature we built a little while ago called the Minute. The idea was that we would deliver one new piece of content that was very short every day, Monday through Friday. And then maybe by doing this, we can get people to form a little bit more of a habit, to actually come back and check the Minute every day, and then start to more habitually use the products overall. The problem is that we got really carried away, right? This was one of the bigger features we'd worked on in a while. We were all super excited about it. And so here you can see the Jira epic. Hopefully some of you are having shivers and are breaking out into a sweat. But yeah, this is the Jira epic. So it was 96 stories just to release the first version of this feature. So we really got carried away. We forgot to be agile, right? We started building this, then scope changed, then things broke. We had to fix tech debt that we created, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then suddenly it was 5 months later and we still had not released this thing. And the problem is that that's great. Maybe this is a great idea, but also maybe it's not a great idea. And you just spent 5 months trying to release something and you don't know it's going to work. And meanwhile, the world around you is changing, right? There are new things happening that you're not able to react to. So this was actually a pretty bad experience for the company. So we realized this, yeah, you have to think big, but you still have to build small, right? It's not an excuse to just pick one thing and work on it for 6 months. You still have to be agile. You still have to release iteratively, learn, and then iterate, and not just commit yourself to a 6-month-long project. So this is another feature that we are in the process of testing and releasing called the Blinkist Insights. It's also a new piece of content in the app that we ourselves are creating. But with this feature, we really took a much more iterative approach. We released something in about 2.5 months, something much smaller that we thought, OK, this is really the minimal awesome product. And then we can test it and we can build on top of it. So 3, feedback is a gift. So it's Monday, January 8th, 2018. I'd been with Blinkist for about 6 months at this point. It's a beautiful day in Berlin. We have 8 hours of daylight. It's 2 degrees outside. And this is what my morning commute looks like at the time. Basically living in the 20s, I guess. And this is the email I received that morning from one of our founders, and also my boss, who leads the product team. So basically, he says that he looked at the last 6 months of ratings in both the Apple Store and the Android Store, and our ratings had dropped precipitously in those 6 months. And guess what were we doing in those 6 months? We were building the Minute that I previously mentioned. Not only had our ratings dropped a lot and much, much lower than the benchmark for apps that we kind of compare ourselves to, but also if you went to our Facebook page at the time for our customers, you'd see that people are not just complaining, they're literally just making fun of us. They're like, oh, wow, you guys really are innovators. You created this new bug that we never seen anywhere else. Great job. So this was a pretty low moment for me because I was a new director of product and I really felt like I had failed our product, I had failed the team. Fortunately, the company culture at Blinkist is really, really strong and very supportive. And so we kind of turned this around and quickly made it a more positive conversation. I decided to make a few changes so we would never end up in this kind of place before. So the first thing we did is made quality a priority. So maybe this sounds a little bit cliche, a little bit trite. What does this actually mean? So it means two things. First of all, we decided to actually grow our QA department a lot and make sure that there were enough people on the QA team to really, really deeply test the product, but also really integrated them into the development process. So it's not like we were just building stuff and then handing it to them over the wall. They were actually there from the very beginning, working with PMs to make sure that the things we were developing made sense for users, and they were kind of thoroughly thought out from the very beginning. It also meant that anybody who feels like there's a quality problem can raise their hand. And if they can explain why there's a problem, we'll stop what we're trying to do, we'll stop releasing new features, we'll make sure that we actually fix the current product. Because at this point, we feel like we're a premium product, we're big enough, we really need to make sure that our customers get the quality that they deserve, and also that we as a business make sure our brand stands for quality and not just for like quickly shipping a bunch of stuff that doesn't work well. We then decided to add more points of feedback. So App Store reviews are great, but they only happen once, and you can't really control when they happen. So it's kind of limited information that you get through them. So there's two things we added. First of all, on the left, we added NPS. And this is actually something we workshopped a lot in this engagement forum in Europe. We got a lot of feedback before we built it, and then after we built it, we brought it back, talked about the success, and I think a few other apps have now actually picked up this idea and are adding it to their own products. But basically, NPS, most of you are probably familiar with. It's an industry standard benchmark. It asks people how likely they are to refer your product to someone else that they know. And there are two nice things about it. One is that because it's an industry standard, you can actually compare yourselves to the benchmark and know how you're doing. And the other nice thing is we ask it over a user's lifetime. So we ask it at 30 days, 90 days, and 360 days. And that means that we can actually see, does people's experience get better over time? Does it get worse over time? What is the pattern? So it's not just a one-time thing. And then on the other side, you see what we call the rated widget. So we show this widget after somebody has finished their first book. And the idea is that it's kind of like just in time. So as soon as they've had this kind of dense interaction with us, we're asking for their experience. And so the feedback we get is pretty informational. It's pretty specific to what just happened and what their experience was like. So we added this feedback, which was great. The problem now was that we're actually getting a lot of information in, but we didn't have anybody that owned that information and that really took care of it. So all the PMs were kind of looking at it, but it was pretty haphazard and pretty messy. And we decided to add a new role called the Customer Feedback Analyst. So for this role, we hired a freelancer named Philip, who had previously worked in customer support, so kind of understood a lot of how this information works. And I'll kind of walk through what his role is. So first, he collects all of the information we get from all of the different sources. So at this point, we get something like 3,000 entries or more per month. There's quite a lot of data there for him to work through. And then he categorizes everything in two different ways. So first, he looks at what part of the product does it relate to. Is it related to the listening experience, to the reading experience, or something else? And then he categorizes everything as either broken, so it's a customer complaining about something not working well, something that's missing, so it's a customer asking for something new that's not there, or working. So it's somebody saying, wow, I really like this feature. Great job. So he does all of this. And then he writes a monthly report that's sent to the whole company and also lives on Confluence where everybody can access it. And in the report, he does two things. So he, first of all, highlights trends. So he talks about what things have changed, what things have improved, what things have gotten worse. Maybe did we introduce a new bug and we're seeing a pattern around it, or did we fix something and people are happier, et cetera. And then he also does a deep dive into a few areas of the product where he really actually mentions customer quotes. And this I find really, really valuable because sometimes the data only tells one part of the story, but when you actually read what people are saying and you can see the emotion that they're using, that tells you a lot more. And there have been times where we saw, in terms of numbers, there's not that much feedback, but the feedback that we're getting is quite Like people are really upset. People are really strongly upset. And that tells us that we still maybe need to focus on this part of the product, even if the numbers are not there. And we've seen a lot of success with this role. We've had it now for about 8 months or so. Everybody on the product team, so product managers, but also designers, look at this feedback all the time, either when we're building something new or when we're trying to fix or improve something. And we've also rolled out a number of features kind of on top of this. So one example is we saw a lot of people asking for 2 things in the audio experience. They wanted more listening speeds, both slower and faster, and they also wanted better lock screen controls. So we built this, we rolled it out, and right away you can see here that the feedback kind of validated what we did. So we saw that negative comments about the listening experience decreased and positive comments improved. So it's really nice because it gives you this feedback loop, and you can really first validate, first figure out what you want to build, but you can also validate, did you actually solve the problem or not? Or do you still need to iterate on the solution? And then lastly, I'll talk about the organizational aspect. So I think, whenever you're making a pretty big change and what you're doing, you also need to think about how your organization should change to reflect that and to sustain that change. So as I mentioned before, like most companies, ultimately in the beginning we had one product team. We had one PM, one dev team, and they were just kind of bouncing around and doing everything. And then when we made this realization that we need to start focusing more on retention, we split into 2 teams. And we work in kind of like the squad model where we have fully functional teams. So we split conversion and retention. The problem is that retention ended up being like 90% of the app. Right? It's basically the whole experience once you've subscribed. And so this basically created a weird dynamic where one team was taking care of most of the product, and it was still very hard to prioritize and to decide what to work on. So we decided to split the retention team and to really think not about the business metric of retention, but rather about user experience. And therefore, we decided to split it by discover and learning. So one team thinks about how do we help people find the right content, and the other team thinks about how do we people actually learn from that content. What's the best experience for them to read or listen? We also then decided to change the conversion mission and make it a little bit bigger. So we're now calling it the growth team. That means we're not just thinking about how to get people over this subscription barrier, but also how, for example, do we enable organic growth? How can we integrate a better referral experience into our product, better sharing experience, better onboarding? Things like this that actually let us grow sustainably and not just optimize conversion numbers. And we're now going through another change, so we're actually taking this learning team, which actually ended up still being too big, and we're splitting it further into content consumption. So this team is going to think about really what is the audio experience? What is the reading experience? How can we take the audio experience and bring it to new platforms? Things like this. And then we have the learning management team, which is basically like, how do you manage the things you've already read? How do you create a learning path for yourself? How do you take notes? How do you highlight things? How do you basically manage your learning process outside of actually just consuming content? And the last thing here is, as you can see, this retention focus kind of went away, right? So what happened? We dropped retention altogether. Well, no. So what we realized is that actually basically every team is responsible for retention, because retention, sustainable retention, comes from the whole experience being good. And so now retention is really something that's jointly owned by all of the product managers, and it's something we meet every week, and we constantly reflect on how retention is going. What else can we do across the different teams to improve it? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. We'd love to take questions now. So please raise your hand. We've got a couple mics floating around. I'll be on this side. We got some people on that side. Come on.
Sure.
For quick reference, how big is how big is your dev team and your product team?
So we are right now, beside me, there are 3 PMs. And the dev team overall is, I think, 45 people or so. The company in general is about 150 people. So
cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. This is super insightful. I have 2 questions. One is, you talked about in the part where you were talking about, hey, big changes require big ideas. And you spent 6 months building that one feature and kind of didn't work. And so you had said, oh, it's really important to iterate and release as you go. I think challenge with that is sometimes you can't really tell if something doesn't work, if it's like the way you executed it because it's so bare bone, or if it's the idea and the concept itself. So any philosophy you have on kind of distinguishing that, that would be really helpful. And then also, as you kind of shifted organizations' focus to retention, you kind of saw that I think revenue monetization metrics and user metrics sometimes is in conflict with each other, actually a lot of times. And as a company, it's hard to try to focus on both. It just kind of dilutes the focus, and so I think you end up sometimes getting in a situation where you're kind of not moving either of it. And so how do you kind of balance that? I know that some companies actually just choose to focus on one at a time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, really good questions. The first one, I completely agree. I think it's a really tough one. I think the problem is there that probably a lot of us are familiar with is that you have the problem and you have the solution, and they're not the same thing. And so you have identified maybe a user problem that you want to solve, and then you might try a solution, it might not work at all, but it doesn't mean that the problem doesn't bear solving, right? And we had, another example that I didn't mention is, for example, we had this idea of articles and Blinks. So we wanted to start doing summaries of internet articles, like long-form journalism. And we launched a really quick, hacked-together prototype that we built in 2 weeks, and it just tanked. Nobody was using it, no one liked it. But then, of course, we were like, okay, well, what did we learn? Did we learn that people don't want to read articles, or did we learn that our solution sucks and that we need to iterate on it? And so I think what's important there is to separate those two things. Build things in a way that you can build on top of. So find a way to build, what we did is really hack together a prototype, and it was impossible to iterate on top of it. So build things in a way that you can then extend. But also commit to things. So if you really think there's a problem there and your first solution didn't work, keep going. Don't just abandon it. I think it's very tempting as a startup to try something, it didn't work, sharp right turn, go somewhere else. I think that's the wrong way to do it. Really commit. If you've already validated the problem is there, that means you still need to solve it. And then to answer your second question, I guess for us the solution is having these split teams. So we have one team that's dedicated to growth and conversion, and that focus never changes. So they are always trying to drive up those numbers. And then we have the other 3 teams that are mostly focused on retention, kind of together. And we believe that for our business, both are really important. So we don't really shift focus. We do both at the same time.
Thank you.
Sure. Here in front. And then you're next.
So you talked about measuring NPS, or you have a ratings widget. Can you talk a little bit about what you do with that data afterwards?
So for us, or for me, I think what's most valuable is the actual content, not the rating. The rating is nice to know that things are not getting worse, and we do pay attention to it. But really, it's this analysis that the feedback analyst does that helps us understand what are the problems that we're seeing. So, we really do we can quickly tell. Sometimes people are complaining about the audio experience, and we need to focus there. For example, more recently, people have started, we see a lot of complaints about the content selection. So people feel like not all the breadth of books they expect are represented. So now we're thinking about this. Or people are complaining about the fact that some of the summaries are a bit too dense and hard to absorb. So we're also thinking about that. So for me, it's really diving into the content and not just the rating. You had a question back there?
Oh, yeah, I have a couple questions. One is a very selfish one. I believe you're in ads on Instagram and Facebook, you personally. How did those perform versus other ads that were maybe less human?
It's a sensitive topic for me because I did not realize what was going to happen when I joined the company.
Very famous.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I hear, and I try to not look at this much, but from what I hear, they perform pretty well in the US especially. I have no idea why. But in general, maybe a kind of more important topic is that we are trying to shift our messaging quite a lot. So what worked really well for us early on is targeting a very specific group of people. And that was basically 35 plus male CEO type. People who have very little time, have a lot of money, can spend that money easily, but don't really tend to retain, actually. They tend to come to the product, use it for a few months, get kind of what they wanted, and then they disengage. And now we're really trying to shift more to a much broader audience of what we call lifelong learners. So people who maybe don't have the same amount of disposable income, but are actually kind of sustainably going to read about not just leadership, not just business, but a lot of different topics. And that also means that our messaging is now undergoing a pretty big change, and we're trying to speak to a much broader audience than we did before. Yep. I think there's a question here and then back there. I don't know if we're, in terms of time.
Yeah, great turnaround story. I love it. I actually wanted to understand so conversion and retention, they really go hand in hand. Like you just took a very good example that, you have to really understand your persona and you market to them accordingly. The conversion happens and then the retention happens.
Yep.
So what kind of challenges did you really experience in conversion and how did you address those as you were trying to understand or lay out the big picture conversion plus retention strategy?
So with conversion, for us, it kind of goes in waves. So, there were times when we were really focused on just optimizing conversion a lot. And now we're actually expanding that and thinking more about growth. So one of the challenges we faced is that people who came from a different background than the one that we were really targeting would come, sign up for the product, and they would not see any content that's relevant to them. So we're now actually completely rethinking our onboarding experience to make sure that we can capture a little bit of your interests, both in terms of data from the campaign you came from, but also maybe like something you can provide us. And then we optimize the early experience for you so we can give you the content that's relevant to you. And then of course we think that ideally this improves conversion, but also retention, because we build a good content experience from the very beginning. You build a good habit from the very beginning, and then ideally we stay with you longer. Yep. Oh yeah. Back.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you settled on the Northstar KPI, especially given that chart of what correlated or what was maybe not causal, but?
Yeah, so this was not, settling on the Northstar KPI was more like we just decided to do it, basically. It didn't so much come from looking at all of the correlations. It was more saying, okay, people are coming to us because they want to learn, because they want to consume content and learn from that content. And therefore, the most important thing we could do is kind of give people the right content so they engage with it more. So they spend more time reading and more time listening. So that's just kind of how we arrived at it. We haven't had these metrics around for very long, so it could be that in 6 months or 9 months, we decide to come up with something that's a little bit more nuanced once we've learned a bit more.
Thanks.
Sure. Yes.
If you're looking to make a product change, you run a couple of tests, but you don't necessarily see any stellar results one way or another. How do you decide whether or not to ship it, keep testing?
Yep. That's a hard one. I wish I had a better answer. I think it's a lot of that is then experience and intuition and starting to see, okay, do we really think we've invested 2 or 3 iterations, we're not seeing the results we want, like trying to figure out why not, but I think it's really tough. I think it's one of the toughest questions of product development. So, but let's talk about it after. Maybe you have some, yeah. Yes, another question back there.
Thank you. It felt like you really took us on a journey of your own evolution through the product. I had 2 questions, actually. The first one is ideas, and I'm fascinated to see how you have evolved and where do ideas come from against all these buckets you have? And the second is you mentioned behavioral data. Do you use data science? If so, how do you incorporate that into your product building?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the first question is like, where do product ideas come from in our organization? So a couple of places, of course. First of all, we kind of as a company are trying to be very bottom-up driven. So we have these teams. Each team owns their own part of the product or their own part of the user experience. And we really kind of try to, let the team own that problem and come up with solutions. So a lot of teams will go off and do kind of research together. They will do these kind of like design sprints together to identify what to work on next. We also recently, or like in the last 6 months, built out a user research team, and that's been tremendous. It's like if you don't have a user research team and you yourself are not super comfortable doing it, I think that's like one of the most important things to invest in, because we've gotten a ton of insight from that and realizing that a lot of the assumptions we were making about how and why people were using the product were completely wrong. Also, the customer feedback analyst thing has actually been really valuable as well. Really reading into what customers are saying, and then not just taking it at face value, not necessarily saying, okay, they're asking for X, so let's build X, but trying to dig in a little bit deeper and understand what is the problem they're having, has led to a lot of new content development or new feature development as well. Sorry, I forgot, what was your second question?
Data science, and do you use that?
This is a new field for us, so we have a freelancer who's looking at all of the kind of product usage data that I mentioned before and trying to find predictors of retention. And then we're also, now that we have a discovery team, we have a data scientist there who's trying to build a better model of content consumption and personalization. But I think still as a company, we're very young when it comes to data science and very young at how to really leverage it to grow the product.
else? Anyone else over here?
One more question.
Sure.
So you mentioned for your Northstar metric you use this content. Sorry. So my question is for the Northstar metric you use this content consumption thing, right?
Yep.
Have you ever considered to go one step beyond content consumption, more like to ask what have they learned actually?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So that's yes. But right now, we don't do any sort of assessment in the product, and we don't do anything to kind of test people's retention. So I think right now, there's no way for us to actually evaluate this. And I think right now, we're not so much focused on like formal content retention, but rather like giving people inspiring content and then letting them consume it how they want. I would say probably in the next 2 years, we'll start making more of a shift towards that. And then I think it would be really interesting to learn. And I think it's not just, there's like what they've learned, but I think another interesting point is like, what are the insights they had? So how often do people consume something and then they have this like moment, this spark, this inspiration? Because we're not really trying to be like, we're not trying to teach people everything. Rather, we're trying to kind of give them the start and then help them learn on their own. So I think it would be really interesting is like, how can we measure the amount of insights that people get? But yeah, I don't know yet how we can actually measure that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry. The lights are blinding, so I actually can't tell who's raising their hands.
Just a quick question. You talked about how your product team changed based on the structure of your product team changed.
Yep.
Did any other departments within your company change based on that feedback? Or?
I mean, so when I say product team in our case, it means QA, engineering, design, BI, and product management.
Right.
So we all changed to kind of create these mission teams, as we call them. But the rest of the company did not. The rest of the company kind of stays. And we actually see now a little bit of tension because we have this kind of more vertical structure on the product side, and then still much more horizontal, like, it's just marketing.
Right.
The other side. So we're trying to think of like, how can we adapt the two and bring them together? For example, CRM has now kind of broken up and now sits in the mission teams. So now every mission team has their own CRM person who's thinking, okay, can we increase learning through email, through push notifications, through something else? So we really are seeing that this mission team structure works really well, but how to adapt it to everybody else, we don't know yet.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got one in here.
Thanks. Hey, so I've been thinking a lot about what you said about NPS, and I'm curious if you know or if you look into the data behind the types of users that are filling out the NPS. I feel like we've tried to get customer feedback in a lot of different ways, and usually it's from most of our responses come from power users, and not that we don't want to build things to make them happy, but they're already retained. Like, those people are staying in the app. I'm curious, like, if you guys have thought about how to get feedback from newer users and how to implement that in a way to increase retention at an earlier life cycle stage.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because actually what we see from NPS is we get, like, most of the people who write in and who actually say something are either detractors or I forget what the supporters, but in the middle we don't get much. So the only way we do it is by having a variety of sources of feedback. So we have NPS, then we have the rated widget that we talked about, then we still have the App Store and Android and iOS reviews. We also have a Facebook group where people leave comments. We then also actually look at all the comments that people leave in their customer support tickets. So I think it's not a perfect solution, but by having so many different sources that come at different times, you can kind of balance it out a little bit. But it's definitely not perfect.
Makes sense. Thank you.